All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, JK, and we are kicking off episode number 197 of Help Me Understand. Before getting into today's episode, where we are going to talk about TDEE, which is Total Daily Energy Expenditure, I first, as always, want to take a moment just to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. Excuse me. The Help Me Understand podcast is one of so many options that you have as far as consuming podcast content, whether it be on a platform that you're currently listening on, or if you're watching this on YouTube. Either way, you have a lot of choices with podcast content. You have a lot of choices with other things that you could be doing right now. Maybe you're even doing something else while listening. Either way, I truly never take it for granted that you chose to press play on Help Me Understand. So thank you for that. And let's go ahead and get into today's episode. So today is a record and post on Tuesday, which means that Tuesdays are going to be our fitness/training/nutrition, focused episodes. So I mentioned that because if you do have a particular topic that you'd like to get my take on, then there's going to be a link in the show notes where you can submit a question, a topic, whatever it may be. And the reason for that is because although I do pull right now the topics and ideas for these Tuesday episodes from questions that I will get, or questions that I'll get from clients, or questions that I'll get from other coaches, or just what may be kind of what's hot in the fitness streets right now. I also want to make sure that anyone who is taking the time to listen to the podcast is aware that you have a direct way to submit a suggestion, because I'm all about coming up with topics that will most directly relate to the people who are taking the time to invest in listening. So with that, let's jump into today's topic. So TDEE, as I mentioned, it's Total Daily Energy Expenditure. And if I really wanted to make this like super spicy, I could name this episode, which I haven't decided on the exact name. I could name this episode something like Why I Decided to Pick a Career in the Least Important Thing When It Comes to Burning Calories. Because, spoiler alert, when we are going to talk about the four components of TDEE/working out, which is what I primarily focus on, is not ranked number one. It's not even ranked number two. It's not even ranked number three. It's actually dead last. So that's pretty exciting for me. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. First, as always, I'll share a little bit of context into why I picked this particular topic today. And I do want to preface this with saying that I'm going to do let's call it like a TDEE 101 sort of vibe here, or a beginner's guide to TDEE, versus a deep dive, peeling back layers and attaching 52 different studies that you can get into. If you are more into that sort of vibe, there are for sure, a number of outlets that you can do that on. For the Help Me Understand podcast, we're going to keep this simple. So a piece of context into what's leading to focusing on TDEE today is a couple of recent interactions with talking with folks who were looking to make some improvement, wanted to either lose body fat, gain muscle, change body composition, all underneath that particular umbrella. And one of the common themes within those conversations has been whether or not they should put a lot of focus around how many calories they were burning during their workouts. And in both instances, they were somewhat surprised with the answer that I gave them when I told them that the least important thing when they are exercising is the tracking of the number of calories that they burned. And so in both instances, we were able to get into a bit of a conversation and really some education around why I have that particular perspective. And so I figured, you know what, this is something that actually is not that uncommon at all, like not at all. And it's something that I have a pretty strong point of view on, and why not bring it to the podcast? So here we are. So first, when it comes to TDE, It stands again for Total Daily Energy Expenditure. And what that basically means is it's the total number of calories that your body burns in a day. So a calorie or a kilocalorie is a unit of energy, and your body utilizes energy. So that's what TDE is. TDEE is. So I wonder why they don't call it TDEE, but it's total number of calories that your body burns within a day. And something to understand at the very base level of this is that it includes absolutely every single thing. And it runs the gamut from simply just being alive to we'll call it the extreme other end of extreme activity and intense exercise. So again, your energy expenditure is something that is constantly happening as long as you are alive. If you are dead, number one, you're not listening to this podcast. And number two, that's the only time that you are not utilizing some sort of energy. So that's going to be something that's really important to remember as we talk about this particular topic. So something that is important is that understanding this concept or understanding the facts around what contributes to total daily energy expenditure is something that I think is pretty important, whether you are looking to gain weight, maintain your weight, or lose weight, regardless of where you are within that spectrum. And I'm using that just because it was part of the conversations that I was having with clients. I'm certainly not here to tell you that you need to do one, two, or all of those particular things. Regardless, though, however, regardless of where you are in that particular spectrum, TDEE is something that you should be aware of, because at the end of the day, when you hear the dreaded, it's all about calories in, calories out, it is all about energy in and energy out. It's just that many times when we think about the phrase calories in, calories out, we think calories in as far as the food that we consume, and we think calories out as far as the exercise that we do. So while you are correct that calories in is controlled by the calories that you consume, the food that you consume, calories out, the energy that's expended, is much more detailed than just the amount of exercise that you do. So calories in, calories out doesn't just equal food in and exercise out. There's so much more to the calories out equation here, or piece of that equation. So let's first start with what we'll call the four components of TDEE. I'm just going to change it. The four components of TDEE. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to list these I'm going to go through these in order of what is the biggest piece of the pie. We're going to make this pizza. So picture a big, large pizza. So your TDEE is a big pizza, hopefully round. And the biggest piece of that, we're going to start with that, and then we'll move to the smallest piece of that. Okay. So first, the main biggest piece that you've got is going to be from something called your BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate. So when it comes to the amount of energy that you expend, so the energy that is utilized by your body, anywhere from generally 60 to 70% of your calorie output is determined by your basal metabolic rate. That is commonly referred to as BMR. So a few things to know about BMR. This is energy that your body uses at rest simply just to keep you alive. So right at the jump, when I talked about the fact that TDEE is referring to any sort of energy that's being expended, whether we're talking exercise or down to the very much like I'm the very most base point, like literally the most base point. I'm just alive and I'm breathing. The alive and breathing, circulating blood, brain function, just the normal, just your body is functioning. That is your BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate. A way that I try to remember that BMR stands for basal metabolic rate, and what it actually means is thinking about it as, instead of basal metabolic rate, I think of it as bare minimum rate. So the bare minimum amount of energy that you need just in order to function and stay alive. So again, this accounts for 60 to 70% of this pizza pie that we're talking about here. So even if you lay in bed for the entire day, you lay on the couch all day and you are binge watching the Love is Blind series. That's front of mind right now because that's kind of what's hot right now. You are still utilizing some energy to blink. You're utilizing some energy to, pick up the remote and say, yes, I'm still here because Netflix is asking, like, what's your deal? Because you haven't moved the screen in a while. Whatever it may be, you are still utilizing calories. So the things that factor into your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, or your bare minimum rate are things like your age, the amount of muscle mass that you have on your body, hormones, and genetics. So when folks are talking about genetics playing a role in your metabolism, more likely than not, if they know what they're talking about, what they're typically referring to is going to be the impact of their genetics on their basal metabolic rate. So again, remember, we're starting with the biggest piece of the pie, the biggest piece of impact to the lowest piece of impact. So a number one here is going to be your BMR, your basal metabolic rate. This is not necessarily something that you can have a overnight, within 24 hours, immediate impact on. So when I think about the four things that I mentioned, your age, your muscle mass, your genetics, and your hormones, from a what can I actually control standpoint, when it comes to those four things, I would say that your muscle mass, you can have a direct impact on. It's just something that clearly takes time and lifting weights. So this is but this is why I am a big proponent and have the perspective that a majority of your focus when it comes to training and working out, whatever header you want to put it under, that it should be focused on gaining and or maintaining muscle and getting stronger, is because I'm aware of the impact that one thing can have on your basal metabolic rate, understanding that a good amount of what you've got going on with BMR is not going to necessarily be something that you can change on your own. Because when it comes down to genetics and when it comes down to age, those are two things that are pretty much, for the most part, undefeated. Like, they are what they are. Now, from a genetic standpoint, you can certainly nurture different things. So just because, for example, let's say that the majority of the men in my family tend to hold most of their body fat within their belly, which is the actual truth. So that's just the deal with the majority of the men in my lineage. That's a physical characteristic that just about every dude in my family that I can think of, when they do hold body fat, it tends to be held in the belly. We don't tend to be, it just tends to be there. We'll just leave it at that. So while that's not something that I can change as far as like the genetic predisposition, there's a difference between me being like, well, there's nothing I can do about it, and then not controlling certain aspects of whether or not I nurture that particular genetic predisposition in a negative way. So I don't focus on activities that could keep me active. I don't focus on proper nutrition. I don't focus on stress management techniques. I don't focus on sleep. Well, that's going to take that particular genetic predisposition and nurture it in a way that just goes further in the negative end, versus if I do focus on proper sleep, focus on proper recovery, things that I know can possibly nurture that in a more positive way, then I'm kind of, for me, more on the right path. And I would also say, from a hormones standpoint, this is something that, I mean, you can't really avoid the fact that hormones are going to have an impact on you, especially as you get older. I was going to say as you age, but especially as you become more experienced and more mature and more seasoned. Again, very similar to genetics, it also can be a matter of what aspects of your hormone health you nurture. So do you nurture those in a positive way, or do you nurture those in a negative way? So when folks are talking about, it's once you kind of hit your fees, like you can't train the same way you did in your 20s, or you can't sleep the same way, or lack of sleep the same way that you did in your 20s, you can't recover the same way. Some of that is for sure true, because hormones do clearly have an impact on what's going on. What I try to focus people on and reframe it is, well, what aspects of understanding where you are hormonally, like what aspects are you nurturing, like what are you feeding, it almost like literally, like what are you feeding when it comes to your hormones. So overall, just to wrap up this first bullet point, again, with the 4 components of total daily energy expenditure, point number 1, the biggest piece of the pie is going to be your basal metabolic rate. So again, that makes up to, we're just going to use a general range, up to about 70% of the calories that you burn within a day are going to be determined based on that. So I'll wrap that particular point up. I don't want that to be taken as like why even focus on it if the majority of it isn't controllable, because it's like genetics, it's age, the reason that I bring that up and have you focus on that is because, again, there's a difference between being predisposed to something and just being like, okay, then I'm going to make that my main focus and go down the negative side of nurture, or I'm predispositioned for this, and understanding that I will navigate things a bit differently so that I can nurture it in a positive way. So again, just that's what we've got as far as BMR, basal metabolic rate. All right, number 2, the next biggest piece of the pizza pie is going to be what we call NEAT, N-E-A-T, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This particular bullet point, or this particular piece of the pizza pie, makes up about 10 to 15% of the energy that you use within a day. So 10 to 15% of the calories that you burn within a day are from what we call NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So the simplest way, in my perspective, to explain this is NEAT is just going about your normal day, everyday movement. So it's calories that are burned from daily movement that isn't specifically structured exercise. Now, even just saying that, like, isn't specifically structured exercise, I know that can even start to get a little bit dicey and spicy, because some time ago, I think it was Dr. Gabrielle Lyons. Yeah, there was a snippet that went like super viral where she was on the Ed Milet show and said something along the lines of like, walking is not exercise, and the internet just about like lost their mind. And I actually went back and listened to the entire podcast, like the whole thing. And in the context of that conversation, I actually agreed with her in the context of that particular conversation. So if you also are feeling like, well, JK, now I can't listen to you because you're crazy too, that's okay. Totally understand that. I would encourage you to go find that episode of the Ed Milet podcast and listen to the context that they were having that particular discussion, because like many things, when you take one snippet of something, it goes viral, which is likely what the intention was. So it went viral, and also it wasn't indicative of the scenario, the setting that they were saying it in. So I'll just leave it at that. So anyways, all right, so back to this. So non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so NEAT, making up about 10 to 15% of your TDEE. So this is daily movement. This is walking around. We will refer to things like fidgeting. So say if I'm here, like right here at my desk, and I'm just twiddling this pen, that is something that's considered non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's NEAT. Anytime that I get up and move around, if I am an expressive talker, I have some friends of mine who are very expressive talkers. Like if they were here in front of the microphone, they would probably have smacked the microphone 4 times, because they're super animated. And we all probably know at least one person like that, then that when they're telling a story, it looks like some sort of like interpretive dance being done at church. If you know, you know. So that's also non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I got some wild examples. doing things around the house, household chores. So folding laundry, walking back and forth to grab the trash. I'm thinking of random things that happen during the day. Those are all considered non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is something that can be super, super different between people. And you're talking like if you've got somebody who is on their feet quite a bit during the day. And when I say on their feet, I mean moving around quite a bit, not just like standing in one spot. However, if they're moving around quite a bit during the day, so for example, like myself, I work in a retail sales environment 5 days out of the week. So I'm in a large building. So most of the time, I am on my feet and moving for an average of 7 to 8 hours a day for about 40 hours per week. So I am somebody who is fairly, I'd say that's moderately active because I'm on my feet the majority of the time those particular days. So my non-exercise activity thermogenesis is actually a bit on the high end. I would say on the high end because I have a active job when it comes to moving around quite a bit. If you are somewhere where you're constantly walking up and down the stairs, that counts too. So those are particular things that do affect your total daily energy expenditure. So that is going to be piece number 2, 10 to 15% of your TDEE coming from non-exercise activity thermogenesis, also called NEAT. All right, now the next one, and this can sometimes be argued with the exercise too, like EAT, exercise activity thermogenesis, but I would actually, I don't know. We'll just say that this one's the next. So this is going to be about 10% of your caloric output is going to be based on what we call the thermic effect of food, also called TEF. We have a lot of acronyms here, the TEF. So TEF is thermic effect of food. That accounts for approximately 10% of the energy that your body puts out. So when we are talking about thermic effect of food, what we're referring to is your body going through the digestive process to break down the food and liquids that you are consuming. There you go. So 10% of your TDEE is related to the thermic effect of food, which is the energy that is used to digest and process food. So something to know is that a general figure is that different macronutrients are actually going to have a different percentage of thermic effect of food value. First, not to confuse anybody. So first, overall, we're talking about, okay, processing food within my body. So digesting and processing the food, breaking it down in my body is going to it's going to account for about 10% of the calories that I burn within a day. Then basically like some sub points underneath that is that different macronutrients, and macronutrients being proteins, carbs, and fats, different macronutrients actually digest generally a bit different. So if you've ever heard somebody say that it's important for you to get in protein, and one of the points that they make about the importance of protein, or one of the selling points or features that they give you about the intake of protein being important, is that it also has the highest thermic effect of all the macronutrients between proteins, carbs, and fats. What they're referring to is that your body works harder to digest protein generally than it does to digest carbs, or that it does to digest fats. So to take it one little bit of a layer deeper, when we are looking at talking to folks about trying to bias towards more whole foods versus the other end of the spectrum of ultra processed foods, like basically I would consider ultra processed to be that food in no way, shape, or form looks anything like the original form of the food itself. I'll just leave it at that, just because I try to keep things simple here, and that one can take us down a whole nother rabbit hole versus like with like processed versus ultra processed versus uber processed versus kind of processed. So yeah, we'll just leave that at that. So generally though, when someone is talking about trying to get in more whole foods, one of the reasons for that is because it then allows your body to actually work through the digestive process in order to break those foods down. So if you are then consuming an ultra processed food, that process has already happened. So there's basically less for your body to do in order to break that down. And you may think to yourself like, oh, well, that's good, right? Like my body doesn't have to do as much work. However, not necessarily. I'm certainly not here to preach to you about processed versus ultra processed as I'm like a massive ice cream lover over here. What I'm just trying to explain to you is some of the why behind the push behind like, hey, let's try to have whole foods, minimally processed, that sort of thing be a higher percentage of what you're intaking, because you want to have your body, you want to have the different components of your internal self like process those particular foods. You want those things to do something. You want them to be performing their functions. Think of it like having some employees on an assembly line, and if you keep skipping a bunch of the steps in the assembly line with those employees, they basically kind of feel like, well, there's no reason for us to hang out, and they don't really do anything. They basically start going dormant because they're not really being utilized. They go off and basically they're kind of useless. They're like, we got no work to do here. So you want to make sure that you keep them employed. Weird analogy, but here we are. So protein, again, highest percentage of thermic effect of food. It's usually about 20 to 30% are utilized just to digest protein. Then carbs would be considered like moderate amount of energy needed to process, and then fats being the lowest amount of energy needed to process. Even though you do feel a bit more full, a bit more satiated with that. That's generally what I've seen in my research. So again, thermic effect of food is going to that is going to make up about 10% of your total daily energy expenditure. And then here we have with the grand finale, last but certainly not least, basically the least important or the least impactful, the smallest piece of the pizza pie when it comes to your total daily energy expenditure is going to be EAT, which is exercise activity thermogenesis. This is your actual intentional exercise working out. So this is what I teased at the very beginning with the spoiler alert, that essentially the part that I spend a lot of time on and a lot of energy and still feel like is pretty important when it comes down to your total daily energy expenditure, when it comes down to just straight up burning calories in that particular activity, working out is actually the lowest percentage of that particular equation when it comes to your TDEE, your total daily energy expenditure. So that includes lifting weights, includes running, swimming, like any sort of intentional exercise that you are doing typically will equate anywhere from generally about 5 to 10% of the calories that you're going to burn that day. So while it is important, it actually makes up such a smaller percentage of your calorie burn for the day than people think. So going back to what I had shared with some context around where this particular topic / question is coming from, the reason why I don't put a ton of focus around the amount of calories that someone is burning during a workout is because at the end of the day, it accounts for about 5 to 10% of your total daily energy expenditure. So if we're going to put 90% of our thoughts and our physical effort into something that is going to yield a 5 to 10% return on investment, I am not sure that you're going to feel like you're getting a great return on investment. So maybe the little bonus question is then why should I work out at all then if you're telling me that it's only about 5 to 10% of my overall caloric burn? I'll give you two main reasons. So reason number one is going to be from a health perspective. And I've done a couple of recent episodes. In a previous episode, last week's Tuesday episode, I think that's the one where I talked about looking to lose fat. Are you looking to lose the right type of fat? Or do you know what you're referring to when you say you're trying to lose fat? So you can listen to that. So when we talk about from a health perspective, lifting weights, getting in some cardio, those particular things help with not only, I'll get to building muscle in a second, but those things help with your body functioning properly. So you should still exercise because it helps with your body functioning properly. The second reason, and I'm specifically talking about lifting weights, is because if we go back to the thing that is the most important when it comes to your overall, or has the biggest piece of the pizza pie or the biggest impact when it comes to your overall TDEE, we mentioned basal metabolic rate. And one of the things that's a portion of your basal metabolic rate is the amount of muscle mass that you have. You get muscle mass by lifting weights. So that is going to be reason number 2 why it is important for you to get in some resistance training, because even though the number of calories that you burn during that particular workout are not really the indicator of whether or not it was a good workout, great workout, or somewhere in between, it will still be contributing to your overall basal metabolic rate or bare minimum rate of energy burned. So I do recommend exercise for those 2 reasons, for health and for building muscle. Specifically talking about resistance training there. Definitely recommend those. So again, just to review very quickly, overall total daily energy expenditure comes down to, generally, 4 components. Component number 1, which is going to be about 60 to 70% of the energy that you burn, is going to come from your basal metabolic rate, your bare minimum. 10 to 15% is going to come from NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's just the movement you have during the day. Remember, we're talking about the friend who's all over the place with their arms while they're talking. Then the next piece of that pie is going to be about 10% coming from the thermic effect of food. So the calories that you eat and drink, your body needs to utilize energy to process those. So that's why ensuring that you're getting in an adequate amount of protein, generally for many people, 0.4 to 1 gram per pound of lean body mass generally tends to be a good range to be within. I'd be a bit concerned about lower than 0.4, but that's a different episode. Maybe that could be a future topic. If you're interested in that, let me know. However, thermic effect of food making up about 10%. So your body needing to process the things that you intake. And then last, certainly not least, but it is the smallest piece of that pie, 5 to 10% coming from actual exercise. Okay. So I believe that's pretty much going to wrap up the things that I wanted to cover for TDEE 101 with Coach JK. All right. So if you feel like this was helpful in any way, then would really appreciate if you left a rating, review, like, subscribe, share, Instagram story, tag me, all the things. You'll see all those options in the show notes if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I would really appreciate it. So we will go ahead and wrap up this episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really do hope that this was helpful in taking a topic that sometimes can either be misunderstood or overcomplicated, and maybe bringing it down to just a very base level of understanding where you should be putting the majority of your energy, pun intended, in to. All right. So with that, take care. Thanks again for listening. I truly appreciate it. And I'll talk to you next time.